My name is Jim Keenan, and with Professor Amy Boski, we are the chairs of the Hawk Street Center Lecture Series. And this evening, we'll follow the same protocol we always do, that rather than either of us introducing the speaker, Susan Reverby, whom we're all delighted to have here with us, we have a student introducing. And so my role is to introduce the student, who will then introduce Susan Reverby. Chiamaka Okori is a senior nursing major from New York City. She has served as a resident assistant for 3 years and is currently president of the Black Student Forum. She received the African and African Diaspora Studies program Amanda B. Houston Traveling Fellowship in 2015. With the fellowship, Chiamaka, I am sorry, I am just got my name, I got names all confused tonight. Chiamaka traveled to Umjimbre, Ghana, where she pursued research on a project evaluating bed net usage of Ghanaian mothers and malaria incidents among children. She has shared this research at the International Conference on Child Rights and Sight at Yale University. In 2016, she was the recipient of the prestigious Martin Luther King Jr. Scholarship. After graduation, she plans on pursuing a women's health nurse practitioner degree and someday working in the field of global public health. Welcome.
Good evening, everyone. And welcome to the Park Street Corporation Speaker Series. My name is Chiamaka Okori, and I'm a senior in the College School of Nursing. When I first heard about the syphilis study at the Tuskegee Institute, I wondered, how could this possibly happen? The Tuskegee study, sponsored by the United States Public Health Service, aimed to examine whether the natural course of syphilis differed between Black and white men. For 40 years, from 1932 to 1972, 500 Black men were lured by the promise of free health care and treatment for ambiguous bad blood. They were not told about their syphilis diagnosis or treated for it. Instead, they were given painful diagnostic spinal taps or back shots, aspirins, and placebo medications. Untreated, syphilis advances from sores to rashes to severe internal damage and even paralysis. Even when penicillin became widely available in 1945, the doctors of the Tuskegee study continued their research. An estimated 128 men died from syphilis or its complications. However, it would be inadequate to only account for the men. Most, if not all of them, returned home to families. Hundreds of wives and children watched their husbands and fathers ravaged by the disease if they were not infected themselves. This was an assault on an entire community, indicative of a greater flagrant disregard for Black lives. The medical exploitation was compounded by many factors: racism, manipulation of the poor, the deceit of the uneducated, and the list goes on. The more I learned about Tuskegee, the more I became intrigued by the nurse, of course, Eunice Rivers-Laurie. If a doctor's oath is to do no harm, then what was hers? I didn't understand how a nurse, a Black nurse at that, could comfort her patients with the same hands who could have, given them treatment. She possessed enormous power as a liaison between the medical staff and the patients. Yet in this uniquely trusted role, she chose to support the research. How could she betray nursing? And how could she betray her own Black community? Instead of endorsing a hyperbolic image of Nurse Laurie, in her article, Rethinking the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, Professor Reverby investigated the invisibility and hypervisibility of a nurse's experience as a Black woman. She illustrated a different side of Nurse Rivers, as a protector and caregiver. Professor Reverby even analyzed Rivers' silence as an indicator of her true feelings, restoring the nurse's voice where before there had been none. She explains the complexities that push people, not tropes, to make devastating moral choices. She examined the way intersections between Jim Crow, federal powers, and political force allowed Tuskegee to happen. such insight is not only welcome, but necessary. It allows us to humanize the people who are caught in events that seem so impossible. Our natural categorization of good and bad becomes complicated. It expands our perspective on the ways racism can be used to both define and erase blackness, even in the scientific database community. When we can dissect the institutional factors that coerce people into such experiments, we do not bear witness powerlessly. It gives us agency. The Tuskegee Experiment only happened 45 years ago. Professor Reverby helps us understand that such events are still very possible, and we must remain vigilant that it does not happen again. A few years after her research on Tuskegee, Professor Reverby also uncovered records for an unpublished research study in Guatemala. From 1946 to 1948, U.S. scientists tested the effectiveness of the new antibiotic treatments by infecting prisoners, soldiers, and mentally ill patients with syphilis and gonorrhea, simultaneously offering them cures. This study, because of its similarities to Tuskegee and its demonstration of poor moral integrity abroad, sparked outrage. Professor Reverby's work became a foundation for activism. Decades later, the victims of the Tuskegee study received apologies from President Clinton, and the people of Guatemala have received apologies from the U.S. Secretaries of State and Health and Human Services. Her research has prompted a reevaluation of bioethics and research as we know it, while telling the stories of hundreds of her studies. In this way, Professor Reverby has given meaning to these events, meaning that has transformed the moral scope of the medical field that I will soon be a part of. Susan M. Reverby is a Marion Butler McLean Professor and Professor of Women's and Gender Studies at Wellesley College. She was, in fact, the first Women's Studies professor hired at Wellesley in 1982. Professor Reverby is an accomplished scholar in the field of medical history, having written several books, including Order to Care, The Dilemma of American Nursing, and Examining Tuskegee, the infamous syphilis study and its legacy, which won awards from the Alabama Historical Association, the American Public Health Association, and Phi Beta Kappa. She is currently working on the biography of Alan Berkman, a global health physician who fought to get antiretrovirals for HIV and AIDS into global South countries in the early 2000s and helped shape U.S. policy. It is a great honor to have someone whose scholarship has gone to the very heart of the problem of ethics in medicine here to speak with us tonight. It is with great humility that I now introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Susan McLean.
Thank you. What a lovely introduction. I really appreciate it. Can you hear me okay? All right. The sound of the air conditioning is quite loud. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about how to think about these experiences and a little bit about horror stories in medicine. The advantage of horror stories is that they often scare us from a distance. They allow us to know fear, but to be safe from it, to have a catharsis from terror, and make possible redemption as the good guys come carrying pitchforks and torches and get to murder the monsters and restore order. Historical studies, especially of particularly gruesome, almost torturous medical interventions that become known spectacles, are a form of somewhat familiar horror stories. Often mined by bioethics, their visceral power justifies the need for principles of ethical behavior in medical care and legislated state oversight interventions in research. In other words, we often need to recognize the horror in order to know what is supposed to be good. But then how do we describe and analyze the horrible in order to make the historical lessons known? I'm going to discuss my own experiences that demonstrate how the preconceived assumptions of melodramatic history, and I'll explain that in a minute, and especially those that link medical research to racial topics, make truth-seeking difficult, and therefore the historical lessons to be learned more blurred than we can imagine. I will argue that melodrama makes for great horror, but is a lousy basis for justice. My scholarship, as you heard, has focused focused on two troubling studies in American medical research history, both of which led to public apologies by U.S. presidents and people in high authority. The first, as you know, the U.S. Public Health Service study of untreated syphilis in the male Negro, better known as the Tuskegee study, 1932 to 72, and these are the two books I did on it, for which then President Bill Clinton apologized in 1997, and the U.S. Public Health Service inoculation, sexually transmitted diseases studies in Guatemala, 1946 to 48. That received worldwide attention, a U.S. government apology to Guatemala nearly 6 years ago, and reports from commissions in both the U.S. and in Guatemala. Each of these studies involved the powerful U.S. government, focused on primarily poor and rural African American men in one case, as you heard, and Guatemalan sex workers, mental patients, soldiers, prisoners in the other. Each entailed deceptions, lack of any serious consenting proceedings, and life-threatening sexually transmitted infections. The study in Tuskegee, as you heard, went on for 4 decades as hundreds of African American men, 439 who actually had late-stage syphilis and 185 controls without the disease were watched, but not supposed to be treated. They were told, however, that the aspirins and vitamin tonics were treatment, and a diagnostic spinal tap was special treatment. So this is a group of the men. The Public Health Service took beautiful pictures in the mid-50s, and I wanted you to actually meet some of them. This is a picture of Eunice Rivers Laurie, the African-American nurse, handing out a pack of aspirins to one of the men in the study. This is her in a cotton field handing a bottle of vitamin tonic to somebody else. This is a picture of the kind of spinal taps that were done, and the men were told were back shots. The study, in contrast, in Guatemala extended for 2 years, possibly longer, recruited nearly 1,500 men and women, or just over 2,000 according to the Guatemalan report, and involved infecting them with syphilis, gonorrhea, and chancroid, and then not treating the majority of them after the infecting. So this is a picture of one of the psychiatric subjects, the site of where the infection was put in. This is a list of exposure list, and this is a copy of the article that I wrote about this. Each study conjures up almost primordial and powerful fears for us: lack of control over our own bodies, the dangers of those with great power, the terror of trusting physician scientists to respond with what many see as close to medical torture, the racism of treating people of color as the other, both in the U.S. South and in the global South. And here's a quick comparison so you can keep the differences of the studies in mind. Each research project had physical procedures that are fairly horrific and pornographic. Diagnostic spinal taps described instead as special treatment in Tuskegee, and the use of sex workers' spinal punctures and the abrading of men's penises and women's cervixes to deliver the disease inoculums in Guatemala. Now, a historian finds the facts for these studies in multiple and usual ways. We read primary material in archives, we do interviews, we look at statistical data. We often don't know what meaning we or others will make of the material once we have it. For of course it depends on what kind of narrative we create, what existing metaphors we develop or struggle against, and the kinds of facts we can both find and explain, what facts we tell and what facts we leave out. None of this, however, has ever been easy, especially in the face of strong beliefs about what the stories are supposed to be about, and the seemingly obvious bioethical lessons to be derived. Given rumors and other explanations too, my efforts required acknowledging and knowing what the beliefs already are, even as I try and say what else might be known. And in the face of a media onslaught over these horrific issues, the difficulties of remaining a careful, thoughtful academic who always wants to say things are more complex and doesn't speak in short sentences becomes even harder. How then was it possible to do this, and should I have even tried? I found some comfort in thinking through the problem of melodramas, spectacles, and tragedies as a way to understand my experience. As often happens, you find that one quote that sort sort of just sums up the problem. And I found useful this quote actually from the late film director Sidney Lumet, who wrote, "In a well-written drama, the story comes out of the characters. The characters in a well-written melodrama come out of the story." Historians, of course, want to be writing dramas, where our historical figures create the story within a historical context, not melodramas, where we already know the story and the characters just fill it in. But when it comes to public discussions of fictional representations of racism and imperialism, and especially in the context of medical research, I want to argue, it is often the melodramatic, where the story drives the characters, happens first. Film critic Linda Williams provides some of a guide here too in her analysis of the melodrama of race that gets seen in America in both actual experiences and in books, plays, and films. Williams' book, called Playing the Race Card, she argues, is full of melodramas, so embedded in the national consciousness that they are almost impossible to escape. She contends that these kinds of simple spectacles and tragedies, performed in melodramatic tones, are the ways we walk, talk, view, and organize our thinking around race, even when we think we are not doing this, and even when we wish to escape them. I have to say the irony of discussing this in light of the election is pretty stunning. I first realized melodrama would be a problem when I began to lecture on the initial work I was doing on the study of Tuskegee more than 2 decades ago now. I was confronted with the belief that the men in the study had been given syphilis by the U.S. Public Health Service, not had the disease already. This belief is reinforced with images of the blood draws that are often cropped. I'll show you this in a minute. So those of you who are in the medical sciences can tell that this is actually a blood draw and his fingers on the syringe pulling it back. But what often gets cropped is all you get to see is either this, which is one of the physicians, which is a white hand on a black arm, or in this case where Rivers is doing it, a black hand on a black arm. To understand why this belief that the men were in fact infected still circulates is to accept, of course, that the study was never, from its very first public exposure widely in 1972, just a historical event or even just a bioethics tale. It became an American allegory, a way to explain the dangers and fears that lurk every time a patient or subject places their lives in someone else's hands, whether for clinical care or a research trial, and a way to speak about racism without directly naming it. There is a reason some of the earliest horror films and stories focus on the dangers of unchecked medical madness and the sexualized power of doctors over the innocent. So think of these early films, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, The Island of Lost Souls, and of course my favorite, Frankenstein. The assumption that in Tuskegee there was infecting with a deadly disease fits this old trope. The monster doctors are infecting the vulnerable story is a powerful tale. Even if, and I think this is the crucial point, at least I tried to make it in my book, if failing to treat and deception, as was done in Tuskegee, is in some ways a much more normative and in many ways more horrible and even more racist, I have argued, for its familiarity. After all, how many have been denied treatment because it could not be afforded, could not get to it, were afraid to access it, were treated badly, or didn't even know there was a problem? For the study in Tuskegee, along with slavery and lynching, becomes yet another example of what happens when African Americans are not valued as rights-bearing citizens. So again, I want to remind, I love this picture. This man is just so beautiful. And these are some more of the men in front of one of the churches in Macon County. In retelling the story, I relied upon interviews, statistical data from the men's medical records that became available in the 2000s, and a rereading of the correspondence to argue that many of them actually escaped to treatment, especially if they survived into the antibiotic era. By the end of the study and before its public exposure, the Public Health Service researchers had to admit to one another that it had become a study of undertreated, not untreated syphilis. My historical accounting tried to show that even Mr. Herman Shaw, the spokesman for the study's last survivors at the federal apology, this is Mr. Shaw with President Clinton, Vice President Gore and David Thatcher, the Surgeon General. So my accounting tried to show that even Mr. Shaw, the spokesman for the study's last survivors at the Federal Apology in 1997, did in fact himself get to treatment in the 1950s, even if it was by accident. The researchers' control, therefore, was never really complete. And this is another picture of 5 of the 6 remaining men who were in Washington for the apology. This story of undertreatment and the possibility of escape, however, cannot balance the revulsion we should have toward a government that knowingly let its citizens be harmed and even wrote about it in 13 published articles over the decades. Like evidence of these kinds of escapes reminds us that subjects can undermine studies in hidden ways. It tells us that the historical truths are often much more complicated than a simple horror story with villains, victims, and good guys. It's still difficult, however, to counter the powerful melodrama or the ease of a simple victim story that becomes the basis for federal rulemaking, was taught in whispers, constantly used in lectures and media accounts, and online ethics courses. For in trying to understand how some of the men might have escaped the study, I had to consider the complicated roles of the African-American nurse, Eunice Rivers Laurie, who was central to the story, and the vagaries of control over African-American lives in the era of the Great Migration North and West, and the need, of course, to have the story told in a particular way. The problem of trying to escape medical melodrama became even clearer as the news of the study in Guatemala became a worldwide phenomenon. I was in the archives at the University of Pittsburgh. It really is in this completely nondescript building in an industrial section of Pittsburgh, to examine the papers of a former Surgeon General when the archivist asked, did I want to see the papers of John C. Cutler, who had taught at Pitt for decades. Cutler was mostly an et al. At the end of a long list of names on several of the articles written about the syphilis study in Tuskegee, really a minor character in the story, mostly remembered because with a pinched face, and I'll show you him in a minute, weird syntax and piercing eyes, he continued to defend the study as appropriate science and good for African Americans on several documentaries made 20 years after the study ended. And this was what was in part really shocking. Think about this, the study ends in 72, it's 92, it's 20 years out, these documentaries are being made. If you're a smart person and you have a PR agent, you stand up there and say, oh, it was really terrible, it was a long time ago, it was the South, blah, blah, blah. You make some kind of liberalish apology. They didn't do that. They didn't even do that. That was what was so amazing. So here, that's not him. I'm going to just show you here in a second. So here is Cutler in the film called The Secret of Bad Blood.
We had no compunction about sending our youth away to war when it's in the national interest. And in terms of syphilis was the leading cause of maternal mortality, leading single cause of admission in the hospital, and the other things. So it was in the national interest to get the information so that you could provide the greatest protection for the entire community, black and white.
It doesn't help that he looks like Liam Neeson in Schindler's List, right? So here he is in a film called Deadly Deception, and I thought this actually was worse. Listen to the opening things he says here. Oops, sorry, wait a minute. Back. Oops, okay. Pushed in the wrong place. There we go.
My regret is, in terms of the study, I have none. As a scientist, to say one would like to have seen an ideal scientific study, but we're dealing with human beings over a long period of time, and this is impossible.
So here's somebody who says, in terms of the study, I have no regrets. It's 1992. You want to go, dummy, have you not figured anything out yet, right? So I'm not exactly a fan of his by the time I'm looking at this material, as you can imagine. So this is 10 years later, right? So I opened his papers hoping to find more about Tuskegee and his views to try to understand him. Instead, I found thousands of pages, laboratory and experimental reports, and photographs with a cover that stated, here's what I found, experimental studies on human inoculation in syphilis, gonorrhea, and chancroid. And then there were photographs like this in the files. Although the ones I saw did not have the people's faces blocked out yet. The papers were for a study that, as far as I knew, no one knew about. Tuskegee had had 13 publications, I want to remind you, that took place in Guatemala between 46 and 48, when Cutler was only 31 years old, and just 4 years out of medical school. Now remember, I had spent at this point a decade explaining that no one was given syphilis in Tuskegee, and here was Cutler and inoculation. As I read the details, the story became increasingly horrific. Here are the key facts that I just want to emphasize. The studies in Tuskegee were approved by the Syphilis Studies section of the National Research Council as a grant to the National Institutes of Health and to the Guatemalan government. Its purpose was designed to obtain information on methods of prophylaxis against syphilis. That means trying to figure out if someone had become infected from unprotected sex and could be given a shot of penicillin or another drug called orvifarsin before they showed up as infected, and whether that would make a difference. And then there were a few other purposes in terms of some of the serological work. This was, of course, 3 years after penicillin was discovered to be a cure for early syphilis once people knew they were infected. STDs cost millions of man-hours, and there was really interest in trying to find out if something could be used as a prophylaxis. Because what was used before that, this is what historians, by the way, buy on eBay when they type syphilis into the search engine. So this is a tube of the prophylactic that would have been given to men in the army during the Second World War, and it burned. So you can imagine there wasn't a whole lot of compliance with its use. And they were really hoping that a shot of penicillin before you went out on your recreation, came off the Navy boat, or was in an army base, would work better. And so that's part of why there was so much support for this. They had also tried a study like this at the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, where they supposedly obtained permission, although we could argue for a long time about whether or not prisoners can actually consent or not, but it hadn't gone very far, and they hadn't gotten much infection delivered. So unlike Tuskegee, the study in Guatemala did involve infecting. So the question, of course, becomes, why would you go to Guatemala? And the problem is, syphilis is a sexually transmitted disease. In Guatemala, prostitution was legal. And even more importantly, inmates in the federal penitentiary in Guatemala City were allowed to bring sex workers into the prison for their services. Cutler and a man named Juan Funes, his co-investigator and head of Guatemala's Venereal Disease Division, recruited sex workers who had already had the infections or infected them, and then used U.S. taxpayer dollars to pay them to ply their trade with the prisoners. Despite this, and even providing alcoholic drinks on the occasion to mimic what Cutler called normal exposure, which is why I called my paper that, the inmates were often opposed to the many blood drawers for testing and proved recalcitrant. Cutler and Funes then moved on to do blood testing at an orphanage, and after that they moved to where they only blood tested, they did not infect the children. And after that they moved on to Guatemala's only mental hospital and its army barracks. Here they began to make an inoculum from infected rabbits. Rabbits also carry syphilis, and street strains of the disease they found in the sex workers, and they began to inoculate the inmates and the soldiers in a variety of ways. Skin contact, direct injection, scarification and abrasion, cisternal punctures. The details were pretty horrendous, and so were the photographs taken by Elise Cutler, and catch this, a Wellesley College alumna. I mean, of all the sister schools in all the world, she would go to mine. And John Cutler's spouse, and she was a trained photographer. So the picture of them measuring and looking at the chancre that developed on this person's arm. They're not measuring the penis, they're looking at the chancre on this man's penis. And this is a copy of a medical report. The circles are mine, but what it tells you is that they took like a cotton pledgelet or a cotton gauze pad, and they would drip the inoculum. They held the man's penis for an hour and a half while they dropped the inoculum, and they were trying to transfer the illness. At the hospital, they offered Dilantin for epileptics, who are a large part of the population, even in the mental institution, and they also brought, and this quote just drove me nuts, it said, "We bought them a refrigerator for biologicals, a motion picture projector that supplied the sole recreation for the inmates, metal cups, plates, and forks to supplement the completely inadequate supply available." All I kept thinking about was $24 in beads from Manhattan. Individual subjects were offered cigarettes, an entire packet for inoculation, or blood draws, or spinal taps, and a single cigarette for clinical observation. Malaria specialist C. Robert Coatney, who had done prison malaria studies, visited the project in February of 1947. In reporting back to Cutler after he returned to the States, he explained that he had brought Surgeon General Thomas Perrin up to date, and that Perrin, quote, with that merry twinkle that comes into his eye, had said, "You know, we couldn't do such an experiment in this country," close quote. And people have used that quote a lot to think about what it meant to go to the Global South, but it also could be explained the problem of trying to transmit and use sex workers, which would have been illegal here, except in Nevada. But they knew they were on the edge. For R.C. Arnold, who supervised, Cutler wrote him and said, quote, "I am a bit, in fact, more than a bit leery of the experiment with the insane people. They cannot give consent, don't know what's going on, and if some goody organization got wind of the work, they would raise a lot of smoke." So one of the other problems was just trying to figure out how many people were involved in all of this. From the report that was later done by the Bioethics Commission, we think these are some of the numbers of how many people were intentionally exposed and how many were tested. There were deaths during the experiment. None of the deaths really were caused by the experiments. I think that's important to show. Syphilis takes much longer to kill somebody. You wouldn't have been able to tell in 2 years whether or not anybody had died from the infection. The other problem was that it was really hard to know how many people were actually involved. This is the report. Again, you can get this if you go to bioethics.gov, you can get this report. But if you look at the bottom number, it tells you how many people were subjects and how many people were infected, they think. And here's the last page, honestly, of the report in which they say the commission did not attempt to identify how many people were clinically infected or how many people received adequate treatment. As a result, the database focuses on the number of individuals exposed to rather than infected with STDs. So I just want to be clear here that we really don't know how much damage they actually did. I mean, we can talk about the horror of the experiment itself, but in terms of actual harm, we don't really, we'll never know. What then is a historian supposed to do with this information? Without a research team trained in biostatistics, which both the Centers for Disease Control and the Presidential Commission on Bioethical Issues had and spent months on, I'll explain that in a minute, I made the decision not to attempt to analyze the thousands of pages of very messy data. This was 2003, and I still had the Tuskegee data, which had just become available to code, and the book would take actually another 5 years to finish. Furthermore, Cutler claimed in his written report and in his correspondence that this had been a study to explore, in part, the use of penicillin and orbis and rifampicin as a prophylaxis. Thus, coming to the material with my knowledge of the study in Tuskegee, where there was no treatment, supposedly, the idea that, even though I found people escaped to treatment, the idea that this study, while it involved infecting, also appeared to be one of treating. Without a careful analysis of the statistical materials, it was impossible to know if all the subjects had or had not been treated. Even after all the research, as I said, the Bioethics Commission couldn't even determine this themselves. So I began quietly to discuss the Guatemala materials with others. However, when I finally finished the final edits on the book 5 years later, the Guatemala material both seemed too complicated and too unfresh in my mind to fit, especially since I was being forced to cut 100 pages out of my original book, so it was going to be a part of a chapter, it just didn't work. So in June of 2009, with the book on Tuskegee completed and my teaching responsibilities done for the year, I returned to Pittsburgh Archives and redid the research to be clear on what I really had found. Because when you go back to your notes after a couple of years, it's like, what was that? You know, when you study for a test and you think, what did that professor say? Right, you can't remember. You need to go over it again more freshly. So given other teaching and service demands on my time, it took until March of 2010 to write the Guatemala material up, and I gave it as a paper at the American Association of the History of Medicine in May of that year. And then here's what really made the story happen. I shared it with David Senser, the former CDC director whom I had become friends with as I had interviewed him about Tuskegee. David had chaired a meeting in 1969 considered a crucial turning point in the study in Tuskegee and had allowed the study to go forward and the men there not to be treated. A Students for Democratic Society, SDS chapter, to which I had belonged in college, even burned censor in effigy outside the CDC offices after the story of the Tuskegee study broke in 1972. Half kiddingly, I reminded him that had I been there, of course, I would have been out there burning him as well. But this time, I think, he was determined to do this one right, and also, obviously, to protect his former organization. It was Censor who asked if he could give my yet unpublished paper on the Guatemala studies to the current officials at CDC, which frankly I had not considered. I only asked him to read it because I wanted an aging syphilologist to read the paper to make sure I didn't make any medical mistakes. When you're a medical historian and not a physician or a nurse or a medical practitioner of some sort, you get killed by the doctors if you get one little dinky fact wrong. So any historian worth their salt, make sure somebody checks the medicine part. So I asked David to do that. And then this is what happened. And this is him right before he passed away, about a week after this last interview, so I always find this one very touching. Oops, all right, I keep doing this. Okay.
Susan sent me an email saying that she had a paper she'd like me to look at for scientific purposes. And as I began reading it, there was a description of the work that had been done in Guatemala. And I immediately called back to Susan and I said, this isn't a scientific problem that you've got. You've got a problem of public relations, and it needs to be not buried in some obscure journal.
Which I was about to do, mind you. So what happened is that David shared it with other people at CDC, and these are some of the people involved in it. They asked for more information, and they asked that I send them my notes, which after I corrected my spelling errors, and my partner and I, it's actually hilarious, we snuck over to, I felt like it was like the Pentagon Papers. So we snuck over to a Kinko's and we Xeroxed everything, all my notes, and then we mailed it actually to Dave Censor at home. Not to the CDC, because someone would then be able to, eventually, if anyone found out that they didn't do anything, you could file a Freedom of Information Act and find out that they didn't do anything. But if it went to David home, nobody would ever know. So think about that for a minute. They did, however, send this man, John Douglas, is the gentleman on the bottom here, their leading syphilologist, to look at the materials and to begin to make sense of the data. So he brought home all the data and had his bioethics, his biostatistics staff analyze the data. Harold Jaffe, who some of you, if you've taken Father Curran's course, should know him. He's comes up in the Band Plays On film. He was one of the early CDC people involved with HIV/AIDS, and he is finishing up his term right now as the Associate Director for Science at CDC. So between Jaffe and Douglas, they mulled it over the summer of 2010, what to make of it, and then it went up the chain of command to the White House, along with Douglas's report. And this gentleman on the right is Zeke Emanuel, a very well-known bioethicist and the brother of Rahm Emanuel, who was then Obama's chief of staff. And Zeke was running, he was Obama's point person on the healthcare initiative for the ACA, and he was also very interested in sort of rule changes around consent and issues in terms of institutional review boards, and I think he understood politically in the way that I could never have how this story could be used. So I was in on a number of phone calls and emails, but most of them took place above my pay grade and my contacts. I agreed with the government that my yet-to-be unpublished paper was to be made available on my college's website when the government apology was announced on October 1st, 2010. Thus, I had the authority of my college behind me and didn't appear to be, I thought, a whistleblower with a book to shill, so I didn't put it on the book webpage, which was politically probably stupid in terms of making any money off the book, but felt morally a better stand. And because the book doesn't talk about Guatemala at all, so it seems stupid to put it there. Now, most historians are not trained to write what-if claims, but there are several worth considering now, since I've been criticized in public for not releasing the material immediately in 2003. I didn't have any contact with David Censor in 2003, and it took several years for that friendship to build up so that we trusted each other. In 2003, I had just begun to write the book on the study in Tuskegee, although my edited book on the subject was out. And even if I had written the Guatemala material up in 2003, I would not have had the authority that finishing the book and having it win some prizes would give me years later. Nor did I have an analysis, I think, that would not have fed into a horror story approach. And furthermore, I had no contacts at CDC. The story had legs because of the apology from the US government in 2010, not just those findings. And furthermore, think about whether or not the Bush administration would have cared about this at all, which is the other point, which is what would have happened in 2003. So it leaves us with a version of, if a historian finds something in the archives and shouts out, will somebody listen? Do we have a responsibility to blog everything substantial we find and hope somebody picks it up? Should every historian have a government official on their speed dial? What if I had tried to publish this immediately in 2003? Would it have mattered? I suspect actually that it would just have become another horror story in the annals. What, as I said, gave it story legs was the government apology. As one of my friends put it bluntly, he said, the United States doesn't usually apologize to foreigners. So I think that that's part of really the story. What I wasn't prepared for, however, and I should have been, was the melodrama that followed. By September, I knew that both Secretaries Clinton and Sebelius would be apologizing and that President Obama would be calling President Colom in Guatemala. Colom invoked the terms first used against the Armenian genocide and called the studies crimes against humanity. So this is a picture of them apologizing. This is President Obama's official photo of him calling President Colom in Guatemala. The president also asked his commission on bioethical issues to explore the history, as you know, and other human subject protections. And I was stunned that it had taken us years, actually, to get the apology for the study in Tuskegee, and this was happening in a matter of a few months, which in government time is like a nanosecond. I still, of course, wasn't so sure I would get much coverage, so you don't want to go gambling with me. What I had not been told, however, was that the government had given the story to Robert Brazell, NBC's science correspondent, the night before and embargoed it. I agreed to post my uncopy edited article on my faculty webpage at 9. Brazell already knew about it and had reported it on MSNBC by 9:02, and by 9:05 he reached me at home, and by 9:30 there was an NBC news crew in my house, and the entire world's media calling because I had stupidly given my cell phone out as the contact number. I thought we would have a couple more days. I had no idea. Quickly, it became clear that much of the press wanted to know the following. How had this happened, and how did I feel when I found it? How monstrous really was Dr. Cutler, the PHS doctor who had run the studies in Guatemala, and this was my favorite. Which was worse, the studies in Tuskegee or Guatemala? My answer there always was, it's not American Idol, you don't get to vote. Because I thought it was a really stupid, but you can see how, so this is an Australian piece that ran, and this is the picture of the doctor doing the blood draw in Tuskegee, but if you looked at that and saw infected, wouldn't you think he was infecting somebody? This is a gentleman in Guatemala that they found. This is one of the tombstones of one of the men in Tuskegee, and that's me looking very hot and bothered because it was 100 degrees and there were fire ants in the cemetery when we were there, and I had sat down. So, how did I, things they don't tell you about doing research, right? How did I feel? That question. Why did anyone, I thought at first, care about how I felt? It was a kind of, when did you stop beating your wife kind of question. When I said I was shocked that this kind of study had gone on, one reporter wrote that I was naive and didn't understand how normative this was for medicine. If I said that I wasn't surprised, then I sounded as if I was callous and thoughtless. Others, my favorite, made me sound as if I were some girl researcher who had accidentally found this material that was being hidden away, rather than a scholar who knew what she was looking at, although obviously not for its current news value, and could write it up in a historically nuanced manner. No one seems to have remembered my favorite aphorism, chance favors the prepared mind. I was also asked, wasn't Cutler a Nazi doctor like Mengele, who had found refuge in Latin America? And in fact, the Guatemalans thought this too. In Prensa Libre, their major paper in Guatemala City, Uncle Sam is looking in the mirror and sees Mengele back. I tried really hard to put Cutler in context, to discuss the ways in which his higher-ups were not so sure this was acceptable research, but still let it go on. as trying to explain why the Public Health Service was so concerned about syphilis and the search for a chemical prophylaxis to prevent infection. The melodrama, however, proved a much more powerful story. Cutler became a Nazi doctor, although there was certainly indeed more in Guatemala to worry about in our relationship, as this ad shows. So this is President Colón with Mrs. Clinton, and the Guatemalan person is saying, basically, let's worry about the fact that you overthrew our government, that you that there was the Cold War, that you funded the paramilitaries in the 80s, and the demand for drugs and the hate of immigrants. So the Guatemalans, in the way the story comes out, become hopeless and pure victims, although once it became clear enough, even when I tried to explain it, that the US government couldn't walk into a federal penitentiary, the country's only mental hospital, and an army barracks in Guatemala City in 1946 without permission, that the Guatemalan government was deeply involved in it, just as the physicians, the black physicians at Tuskegee had been with that study, even if obviously there's enormous power differential. Why governments or medical professionals might agree to such a study in their under-resourced area never gets as much attention, and is certainly not as interesting as the melodrama. The internal racism within Guatemala, because most of the people involved were Mayan Indians, also got very little initial play, except among Guatemalan scholars. Much of the story in October of 2010, depending on who wrote about it and where in the world it went, played out with all the melodrama, the bodily physical violations, the use of US taxpayer dollars to infect sex workers and send them into a prison to ply their trade, the power of the US government in a global South country, innocent victims, the horrors of the abuse of medical research authority at the same time, as the US was prosecuting Nazi doctors at Nuremberg, and of course the sexual nature of it all. Again, the emotions of the responses of the government secretaries who called it abhorrent and terrible. My own findings and those of people in Guatemala galvanized the press coverage that went across the world within the week, and meant I was fielding questions from everyone from the BBC to the Chinese news agency to Al Jazeera. At least 3 filmmakers also made contact, and of course you'll appreciate this, 4 tort lawyers. Quickly, the heads of CDC and the NIH sent out a short article that was published that denounced what had happened, explained the protections now in place, and tried to reassure everybody, of course, that this was in the past and would never happen again. Thus, the melodrama of a bad doctor, a different time, and innocent victims played out against the apology for wrongdoing set in another country and another time. So here again are the 2 reports that came out from the government. The Bioethics Commission's reports made clear the institutional support that made the study possible and issued a claim of blameworthiness against the doctors who ran it. But even though they struggled not to tell the story as a melodrama, the news reports picked up on numbers who had died, even if none of this was caused by the research and the vividness of the case examples. As you might expect, a law firm found 7 individuals in Guatemala who claimed to have been harmed by the studies and filed a lawsuit against the United States under something called the Alien Tort Statute of 1789 that allows U.S. courts to hear claims from non-U.S. citizens about breaches of law outside our borders. The suit was dismissed, and the U.S. has more quietly provided money for ethics and STD training in Guatemala. I think about $1 million from what I can figure out. A year and a half ago, another lawsuit developed, this time suing, so that's the investigation in Guatemala. Last year, another lawsuit developed, this time suing Johns Hopkins University, the Rockefeller Foundation, and a drug company that provided the penicillin for complicity in the study on behalf of 750 Guatemalans. This claim is that 70 years ago, faculty at Hopkins, the leaders of the Rockefeller Foundation, quote, helped design, support, develop, encourage, and finance and participated in and benefited from this study. They also sued the drug company that provided the drugs, and they asked for $1 billion in compensatory and punitive damages. They lost round 1 in the courts, and they still appeal. And finally, last December, the Archdiocese of Guatemala has filed a suit at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights against the U.S. and against Guatemala for, quote, human rights violations and crimes against humanity. As civil rights attorney Robert Garcia, who has worked on the case, argued, apologies are not good enough. Truth and reconciliation require treatment, compensation, and restorative justice. So in conclusion, The scholarly literature on race and melodrama warns us that it will be very difficult ever to escape the melodrama when it comes to horror stories in medical research, and my own struggles, I think, back up that analysis. I accept that the first steps, but only the first steps, to change requires that there be an acknowledgement that something horrible has happened. I try in many of the media interviews to remind people that an apology only does that. It acknowledges an error or a wrong, but it doesn't predict or control future behavior. I made an effort to make sure that the differences between what happened in Tuskegee and Guatemala were clear, even if the seemingly same bad guy doctor linked them together, and I refused, as I said, to vote on which was worse. I have, over the last 6 years, spent much time helping medical personnel to understand why they should try and imagine how they could easily become Cutler, not just how they shouldn't be him. I made the case that today, with the widespread globalization of clinical trials, how we regulate and watch over human subject research in other countries really matters, even more. I've argued that a search for other terrible studies might not be worthwhile, but focusing on what we do now really does. I made an effort to explain that a binary of endless medical research and violations of human rights are not necessary, even if just making more regulations are not the solutions. I've argued we need to avoid just thinking about a simple good and evil, or emphasize the individuals in stock melodramatic stories while we pretend that the structural factors that create the problems in the first place can be ignored. In the end, I think melodrama reminds us of the horror of the stories, in part to motivate us to act, to begin to think and take action, but it cannot stop there. In the face of, quote, moral confusion and disarray, literary critic Linda Williams concludes, melodrama is organized around a paradoxical quest for full articulation of truth and virtue at precisely those junctures where both truth and virtue are most vexed. And yet the stories of these studies in Tuskegee and Guatemala may not seem vexed to all who only hear about them through quick rumors, media accounts, or the emotion of the horrible and the abhorrent. The melodrama of these two studies will help us to begin to focus our concerns, but whether we just weep or make change, I think, depends on how we understand why these studies happen in the first place and how much the emotion motivates us toward complex changes in social policy, not just in wringing our hands, moaning over simple evil by seemingly bad men, and making up more procedural regulations. Melodrama makes for emotive but ultimately limited theater, and even for good performative apologies. Similarly, melodramatic history may get us to pay attention, but it is ultimately, I want to argue, a poor guide to making social policy and to achieving justice. Only the real drama can do that, and then our effort to find ways to provide compensation and remediation for those who are harmed, and to punish those who perpetuate their crimes, and to understand why it all happened in the first place. Thank you.
I just want to say, I'm Amy Boski, and I just want to say we have time for some questions, comments, thoughts. And there's mics that are coming around, so if you use the mic, everyone can hear you.
None of this worries you?
Can I say something? Sure. So this is very interesting. I've read some of your stuff before, and as an ethicist, my worry is always about the implications of this and the things that we know from cognitive science and moral psychology related to what's needed to develop human beings to be more aware. And I'm just wondering, since we're in an educational setting, if you had some insights about how educators can use some of these insights to help people.
Right. So I wrote about this in another paper, and I was telling the students I was with earlier. Cutler, in other places, really talks about, you can hear the language, we were in a war against syphilis. So I think one of the things we can help people do is think about what it means when doctors think they're in a war against a disease or an enemy, and how that makes them the general in a war, and the patients or the subjects become the collateral damage soldiers that they have to send out. And we know in a war that a general has to do that. So I think we have to think through, in fact, the use of the war metaphor and what the limitations of it, where it gets us. I think we have to understand why just label Cutler a Mengele monster or even is wrong. It's just not helpful, because then it's too easy for all of us to go, I'd never do that, I'm not like that guy, right? And as I said, it doesn't help, he looks like what he looks like. So, and speaks the way he does. You know, honestly, if he looked warmer and friendlier, it might be easier. But, so I think that's the part of the education has to be, why did they go through with it? And that's why I wrote this whole, two chapters that I thought were the most, for me, morally difficult to write. In the Tuskegee book were both about Rivers and Dr. Dibble, who was the black physician also who goes along with the study. Because why did they do it? Why does Juan Funes in Guatemala think it's okay? And I think unless we understand the way institutions of racism work, that is how people think that they're doing the right thing, can be easily brought off, think that this is the best, or in what I argued in both Dibble's case and in Rivers' case, I think they were sneaking people out. There's an expression in the South that's called in the booth in the back in the corner in the dark, and I just think there was a lot going on in the booth in the back in the corner in the dark, and that things go on and you don't know about. So that's how I think a lot of these guys got out of the study. And in Mr. Shaw's case, when he got out, was that he got pneumonia, and so he goes to a hospital 10 miles from Tuskegee in the 50s, and they put him on IV penicillin for 10 days. So the control is not, and I think we just use the plantation in slavery, or we use the concentration camp as the model. So I just think trying to help students think about how did it happen, what are the institutions that make it happen, how do these individuals think they're doing the right thing unless they're just sociopaths. I mean, that's one way to answer the question. But if you don't think they're sociopaths, and I actually think none of them are, then you have to really understand why they did it. And then you have to play it out in your own head. What would you have done? I think you have to role play it a little bit. You have to think about it. I mean, Rivers drove me crazy for years and years and years, just trying to think her through. Yes, sir. Great, I appreciate the mics, and I've got hearing aids, and it makes a real difference if I can hear you.
Thank you very much for your presentation and also for your work. And my students appreciate you because we study what you have done. I wanted to ask you a question about responsibility. Individual responsibility versus institutional responsibility. So, both in the case of Tuskegee and Guatemala, what is the balance between these two types of responsibility? Are we thinking about, as you said, the bad guys or bad dynamics within institutions, or both?
Right.
Thank you.
Right. I think we, it's so funny how you end up doing your research that repeats the things that bother you endlessly in your life. I did a paper, I was just remembering this, when I was in undergraduate that was in a drama class, and it was about two different Bertolt Brecht plays, and I tried to explain why one, the good woman doesn't succeed, but in the next one she does, and it's because the institutions shifted, so that you can't just be a good person in a bad place. But I think it raises really hard questions for people about how to act ethically. And I once got into an argument actually with a nursing ethicist when I was doing my other work 20, 30 years ago now, who said, well, if something really bad happens, you have a right and responsibility as a nurse to stand up and whistleblow and to stop it. And I said, well, what if you have children and you live in Western Mass and you're a single mom and this is the only job, is your responsibility, who's your responsibility too? And I just tried to say, we need to really think about ways not to just say people to do the right thing. We have to really help them get support, understand why they might not act in the most ethical way in certain circumstances. But I think what worries me about these studies, again, is if you make Rivers or Dibble or the docs, who are the public health service docs, or even Cutler and Funes the only villains, then you don't understand how it got set up and why what they thought they were doing was right. So that's the term I was telling someone I just wrote an op-ed for the American Journal of Public Health, and I called these kinds of studies historical misfeasance, because misfeasance is the word we use when public officials do something wrong that's actually illegal. Because none of this was illegal work. It wasn't like they had their hands in the till. Nobody made money, really, on any of this. I mean, their careers advanced, but nobody really made money on this. So it isn't the same thing as, you know, stealing from the public funds. So I think trying to help people understand how these things happen institutionally at the same time as we understand what might else they have done. Like with Rivers, I mean, you can read a million things about her. It's so interesting because a lot of people really want her to run out into the public square in Tuskegee and scream her head off. Now I'd like to remind you that in the public square in Tuskegee is a Confederate statue put up with the Daughters of the Confederacy, and in the period the study was going on, Rivers was not allowed as a black person to walk in front of the public, in the public square in front of the statue. So where would she have yelled? And if she had yelled, they would have replaced her with somebody else. So I think she did, that's my argument. I mean, Jim Jones, the other historian, was sad, who met her, she had passed by the time I started to work on this, and he said, she would have told me if she had done anything to get people out. And I thought, nah, she wouldn't have told you. You're a white Southern man. She wouldn't have told you anything. So I thought I had enough evidence to make an argument, at least that it's certainly possible. Because so I think that's one of the things we have to think about. What happens when you're in an untenable situation? What are the ways around it other than standing in the public square and screaming? What else can we help people understand are ways to undermine it? And, you know, we're talking about a different era. Nobody had Snapchat, and nobody had, you know, an internet, and, you know, just the kinds of things. And nobody was Edward Snowden here, you know, and there's just aren't the same ways to do it that we can think about now. Okay. What else? I'm just curious, I mean, some of you probably in class have learned about this, but if you didn't learn about this in class, how many of you knew anything about either one of these studies before you came? So, even, or just before class? Did you know about it before class? So very few. See, I think one of the things that's really interesting, like the Guatemala thing changed my life, right? Norma's story, I don't know. I mean, what's interesting about Tuskegee is because we have such a large African American population, because it helps change regulations for informed consent and for institutional review boards, the story gets carried over, and any of you who have done ethics training have probably had to learn about it. But I don't think, I mean, I've talked to people in the city's program that does a lot of the online training to see whether the Guatemala story is going to make it in there, but I will bet you that no one, and there isn't a big enough community, frankly, to carry this story forward. So it's going to be interesting to see whether in 5 or 6 years anybody even knows anything about the Guatemala story. It'll just become another historical horror story, and that's what deeply, frankly, troubles me.
Hi Susan, I actually have a question for you. I was wondering about. So I'm thinking about the kind of logic of the for the greater good and the progress of knowledge and science, and you know, this is a noble endeavor and somebody has to do it and somehow it has to get done, and you know, yes, we count the cost, but you know, hope for the future kind of thing. And I'm just wondering where else, or if you see that narrative or that kind of logic now in your current work or just out in the media. Are you still hearing that voice? Is that still in science?
Absolutely, and I think, I mean, I'm someone who got pneumonia actually myself at 14, and thank God for penicillin, I'm going to be standing here. So I'm very grateful for the research. I'm not someone who thinks you can just, you know, take chicken soup and be fine most of your life. So I actually think science matters. And my dad actually did some of the earliest research on penicillin for bacterial endocarditis, which was then a death sentence. And I actually asked him, I said, what kind of informed consent did you do? And he said, well, we told the patients if they didn't try this new drug, they'd die, which wouldn't pass an IRB board now, but at that point was actually the truth. I mean, he wasn't lying. So I think part of it is trying to think through how we share the burden. So one of the questions is why have we always historically thought that poor people should pay for the privilege of health care by putting their bodies on the line in public hospitals and training. So, I mean, Zeke Emanuel has argued, for example, that as part of citizenship, everybody should volunteer for, you know, that should be required to be in a research study. And that raises a whole set of questions, too, about protections, but it does at least raise the question of why should it only be these people and not those people. And I've always said yes, for example, whenever my docs, they're going to bring a slew of med students with them, and I would say yes, because I think it's really important that someone like me gets learned on as opposed to just people who don't feel like they can say no. So I think we have to think through that kind of question of how we share the burden, and I think we have to do a lot of educating. And the question that gets raised all the time in this is it's complicated, and I'm not an ethicist by training, so I don't know the easy answers here are, like with some of the Nazi science. So some of it was actually pretty good science. Do we use the results or not? Is also one of those thought questions that people raise all the time. I mean, the story with Guatemala and Tuskegee is easier. The science was a mess. For those of you who know anything about clinical trials, when 12 to 15, as far as I can figure, of the men who were in the controls didn't turn out got syphilis themselves, they switched them into the other arm of the study, and then when they did the autopsies, some of the men they thought were syphilitics, in fact, had no syphilitic lesions in their bodies, but they never switched them back into the control arm. So the data is a disaster as a kind of clinical piece of work, and so the science just sucked, frankly, and was done badly. So we don't have to worry about that. It's not really, I mean, what we learn here is what we know, which is if you don't treat it, a certain percentage of people will die from the disease. Well, we knew that in 1932. We didn't need the research to prove that, but at that point, the racism was really part of it because they actually thought the disease was different in black men and in white men, and white women and black women, and so they were interested in looking at what would happen if people were treated. And there was some arguments even in that time period about whether or not treatment was worse. So at that point, they're treating with mercury. So you know from the Alice in Wonderland study book, The Mad Hatter, is because you use mercury to stiffen the felt in hats, and then it would drive people, then you would become insane from the mercury poisoning. So there was a lot of concern in this period, frankly, whether the drugs were wrong. So you could maybe make a moral argument. I would not make it, but others have made the argument that the study isn't immoral until 45 or 46 when there's penicillin. But the logic of the study from the very beginning was non-treatment, and there was treatment, and people were treated individually, and these men were never treated as individuals. And that's an issue.
So I guess this question is just going back to the part about how melodrama is actually prohibitive of justice and adequate or the best ways of making policy. And so I guess I'm just thinking that a lot of melodrama has gone into the election season that we just got out of, and is going into all of the discussions that are surrounding what is going to happen. And I guess I was just wondering, now that we're talking about things that happened in the past, and so I guess I feel like it's almost, I don't want to say easier, but it's different to talk about the melodrama of a past time and be able to kind of look at the logical aspects when less people are feeling the emotions surrounding the melodrama as victimized individually, personalized. Which isn't the case here. So I guess my question is, how would you say we should push through the melodrama and talk about the...
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people are using Kubler-Ross's 6 or 7, whatever it is, stages of grief to analyze this. I teach at Wellesley, and you can't imagine what it was like out there last Tuesday night, Tuesday, because, it was like this big wedding we were having, and then it turned into a wake, within a couple of hours, and it was just god-awful. So I feel like I've been going through all those stages. Thursday morning I was driving, and I started weeping uncontrollably in the car. So I feel like I'm at whatever that stage is, I'm there. So I think what I argued is I think you do need the emotion, because it was played out in stereotypes, in melodrama. You could argue that it's melodramatic to call all Mexicans, rapists and criminals, and all of the various things that got used, or even the criminal Hillary and the language back and forth. So the melodrama, I think, is there, and we're all suffering from it at the moment and feeling it, but I think as it goes forward, people are starting to think about how we're going to mobilize. And so I think what's going to happen is there'll be more, the melodrama will end, and then we'll have to really try to think about how to actually look at what's happening and not just see them as stereotypes, but to actually look at exactly what Rachel, I mean, I think it's going to be fascinating for the conservative Jews who have supported the Republicans for a really long time to figure out what to do about Bannon and how they're going to try and rationalize his anti-Semitism. It's not even just an anti-Zionist, he's clearly an anti-Semite. So what then? So how are you going to manage that? And so I think we're just going to have to figure out how to fight back. And I think that the only good thing about this is the amount of mobilizing that's happening. And I've been around. I mean, I hate to say this to you, those of you who are younger, but we survived Nixon, we survived Reagan, and I know this feels worse. And so what I said to my students, I gave a talk yesterday at the college, I said, when I woke up, I thought about 1877, really. So that's where Reconstruction ends, and the Republicans make a deal to get the presidency, and they withdrew the federal troops from the South, and then all the Reconstruction governments fail, and the beginning of Jim Crow gets set up, and the rise of the Klan. So it feels a little bit like that to me historically, except I remember we're better organized. We are better. There are more people. There are a lot more people organized. A lot more people. We have a political language to use to think, and I think that's the only encouraging part of this that I see as someone who's been in the streets really since I was in college. Thank you. Well, thank you very, very much for your time. I really